The sky was clear, and the sun shone brightly over the Grand Palace, a historic landmark that attracted thousands of visitors every day. The air was filled with the sounds of footsteps, camera clicks, and excited whispers as tourists admired the beautiful architecture and the rich history of the place. Among the crowd was a man who stood out, not because of his admiration for the palace, but because of the way he carried himself. He walked with an air of superiority, as if the world revolved around him. Dressed in expensive designer clothes and wearing a watch worth more than some people's yearly salary, he had the look of someone who had never been told no in his life. This man was a wealthy tourist who had traveled the world, staying in the finest hotels and eating at the most expensive restaurants. He believed that money could buy anything: respect, power, and even the right to do whatever he pleased. He was used to people treating him with extra care, bending rules for him simply because he was rich. To him, life was a game where he made the rules. And today, he was looking for entertainment. As he strolled through the palace grounds, his eyes fell on the royal guards standing in a straight line near the entrance. Dressed in their traditional uniforms, they stood perfectly still, their expressions unreadable. Their discipline and focus were legendary. No matter what happened around them, they never reacted. Tourists often tried to make them smile or move, but the guards never broke their stance. This intrigued the rich tourist. He saw them not as dedicated soldiers doing their duty, but as something to amuse himself with. A smirk appeared on his face as he turned to his assistant, a man who followed him everywhere, carrying his bags and handling his requests. "Watch this," the tourist said, pulling out his phone. He wanted to record himself testing the limits of the royal guard, thinking it would make for an entertaining video to share with his wealthy friends. He approached one of the guards, his expensive shoes clicking against the stone pavement. The crowd around him moved aside, sensing something was about to happen. Some watched with curiosity, while others frowned, already guessing that trouble was coming. The tourist stood in front of the guard and waved his hand in front of his face, waiting for a reaction. The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, just as he had been trained to do. The tourist chuckled. "Oh, come on, you're not even going to blink," he said, leaning in closer. The guard didn't move. Annoyed, the tourist stepped back and pretended to trip, flailing his arms dramatically as if he were about to fall onto the soldier. Again, there was no reaction. A few tourists in the crowd shook their heads, clearly unimpressed by the man's behavior, but he didn't care. He was having fun. Then an idea popped into his head, something that would surely get a response. He reached into the bag his assistant carried and pulled out a small can of red paint. His assistant's eyes widened in shock. "Sir, maybe this isn't a good idea," he whispered nervously. But the tourist ignored him. He popped the lid off the can, held it over the guard's crisp uniform, and let the bright red liquid pour out. The paint splattered onto the soldier's shoulders, dripping down his chest like spilled ink on a perfect canvas. The contrast of the red against the dark fabric was striking. A collective gasp spread through the crowd. Some people quickly pulled out their phones to record, while others looked around, expecting security to arrive any second. The tourist laughed, stepping back to admire his work. He was pleased with himself. "Now let's see if he reacts," he muttered under his breath, still holding his phone up to capture the moment. For a brief second, there was silence. The only sound was the soft drip of paint hitting the pavement. The guard remained still, but something had changed. His posture, once neutral, now carried an air of authority. His grip on his weapon tightened slightly. And then, in one swift movement, he stepped forward. The moment the royal guard took a step forward, the atmosphere changed completely. The crowd, which had been watching in stunned silence, suddenly came alive with murmurs and whispers. Some people gasped, while others instinctively took a step back. The tourist, who had been grinning just moments ago, felt his confidence waver. He had expected the guard to remain still no matter what he did. After all, Weren't they trained to never react? But now, as the soldier moved with precise and controlled authority, the tourist realized that he had made a serious mistake. The guard's voice was firm and powerful as he issued a command, his deep tone cutting through the noise of the crowd. Though his expression remained disciplined, there was no mistaking the seriousness of the situation. He was not just standing there for decoration. He was on duty, protecting a place of great importance. The red paint dripped from his uniform, staining the ground beneath him, but he paid no attention to it. Instead, he swiftly raised his rifle to his chest, holding it with perfect posture as he signaled with his free hand. Within seconds, another guard stationed nearby moved into action. He turned sharply and gestured toward the palace entrance. It was clear that a protocol had been triggered. The tourist, still clutching his phone, suddenly felt uneasy. This wasn't a joke anymore. The laughter that had been in his eyes moments ago was replaced by uncertainty. His assistant, standing a few feet away, looked around nervously, as if trying to find an escape route. The crowd grew larger as more people gathered to see what was happening. Some recorded the scene, while others whispered among themselves about the consequences of disrespecting a royal guard. The tourist tried to keep up his act of confidence, but deep down, panic was starting to settle in. He was used to getting away with things, but something about this situation felt different. He had never been in a place where his money and status might not protect him. Then, the palace security arrived. Two officers in official uniforms approached quickly, their expressions serious. They moved with purpose, and there was no hesitation in their steps. As soon as they reached the scene, one of them spoke in a calm but authoritative voice, asking what had happened. The guard, who had been splashed with paint, did not say a word. He didn't need to. His stained uniform and the videos being recorded by the crowd were enough proof of what had taken place. The tourist chuckled nervously, raising his hands in an attempt to act innocent. "It was just a joke," he said, his voice lacking the confidence he had displayed earlier. "Come on, I didn't mean any harm. I was just having a little fun." But the security officers were not amused. One of them gestured toward the tourist's phone. "Are you recording this?" he asked firmly. The tourist hesitated before lowering his phone. Yeah, but it's nothing serious," he said, trying to brush off the situation. One of the officers turned to the crowd. "Who saw what happened?" he asked. Immediately, several hands went up, and voices started speaking at once. People described how the tourist had mocked the guard, waved his hands in his face, and then poured the paint over him. Some even played back the videos they had recorded, showing clear evidence of the act. The tourist's face paled. He had never been held accountable for his actions before. Usually, if he got into trouble, his lawyers handled everything, or his money could smooth things over. But now, in front of all these people, he couldn't just walk away. One of the officers looked at him sternly. "This is an act of vandalism and disrespect toward an official on duty," he said. "You need to come with us." The tourist's heart started pounding. Wait, hold on. You don't understand. I can fix this," he said quickly. "I'll pay for the uniform. I'll donate money to the palace, whatever you need. Just let me go." But the officers didn't even blink. They stepped closer, ready to escort him away. The crowd watched in anticipation, some whispering about the consequences he might face. His assistant took a few steps back, clearly not wanting to be involved. For the first time in his life, the tourist realized that no amount of money or privilege could undo what he had done. The moment the officers placed a firm grip on the tourist's arm, his entire body tensed up. He had never been handled this way before. People usually treated him with respect, or fear, because of his wealth. But here, in this foreign country, his money seemed to mean nothing. His confidence, which had been so strong moments ago, was now crumbling. The crowd watched in silence as the officers led him away from the palace grounds. Some whispered among themselves, while others kept their phones raised, recording every moment. The tourist could hear bits and pieces of their conversations. He thought he could do anything and get away with it. Disrespecting a royal guard. That's not going to end well. Look at his face. He's realizing his money won't help him this time. Each comment made him feel smaller and smaller. His assistant trailed behind nervously, unsure whether to follow or disappear into the crowd. He had always relied on his employer's wealth, but now he wasn't so sure if staying by his side was a good idea. The officers walked with purpose, not slowing down for the tourists' protests. "Just tell me how much you want." One of the officers gave him a sharp look. "This isn't about money. You broke the law." Those words sent a chill down the tourist's spine. He had been in trouble before, but there had always been a way out. A quick call to a lawyer, a large donation, or a well-placed favor had always done the trick. But now, as he was escorted through the palace gates and into a waiting police car, he felt a sinking realization. This was serious. The doors closed behind him with a heavy thud. He sat in the back seat, gripping his phone tightly. His mind raced, searching for a way out of this mess. Maybe he could call someone important. Maybe his father's connections could help. But as he unlocked his phone, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. His face was everywhere. Social media was exploding with videos of the incident. Thousands of people were sharing, commenting, and criticizing his actions. His name, once associated with wealth and privilege, was now being dragged through the mud. People called him disrespectful, entitled, and a disgrace. Some even demanded that he receive the harshest punishment possible. His hand started to shake as he scrolled through the posts. It wasn't just strangers talking about him. News outlets had already picked up the story. Headlines appeared on his screen. "Wealthy tourist disrespects royal guard, faces immediate arrest." Shocking video. "Tourist pours paint on royal guard, faces legal action." Public outrage as tourist mocks palace guards. Will justice be served? This wasn't just a small mistake. This was a disaster. The police car stopped in front of a large building. As the doors opened, the tourist hesitated, but the officers gave him no choice. He was escorted inside, where a serious-looking officer waited for him. The man looked through some papers before speaking. "You are under arrest for vandalism, public disorder, and assaulting an official on duty," he said firmly. "You will be processed and held in custody until further notice." The tourist's throat went dry. "Wait, arrested? You can't do that. I have rights." The officer remained calm. "And so does the royal guard you disrespected." For the first time in his life, the tourist felt truly powerless. His world, built on privilege and arrogance, was collapsing around him, and no amount of money could stop it. Sitting in the cold, gray holding cell, the tourist felt his entire world crashing down around him. Just a few hours ago, he had been laughing, confident that he could do whatever he wanted without facing any real consequences. Now he was in a foreign jail, surrounded by plain concrete walls and a metal bench that was nothing like the luxurious seats he was used to. His designer clothes, once spotless and stylish, were now wrinkled and stained with dried red paint from his careless act. His phone had been taken away when he was processed, so there was no way for him to check the latest updates or call someone for help. He had always relied on his wealth and status to fix problems, but now he felt completely alone. His assistant had disappeared the moment things got serious, and there was no one here to bail him out with a quick payment. He could still hear the voices of the officers echoing in his mind. "You will stay here until further notice. The court will decide your punishment." The words made his stomach tighten. Court. Punishment. He had never even thought about these things before. He had always believed that rules were for other people, not for someone like him. But as he sat there, staring at the dull walls, he realized that he was now just another prisoner waiting for judgment. Meanwhile, outside the jail, the world was reacting to what he had done. The video of him pouring paint on the royal guard had spread like wildfire. Social media was filled with angry comments from people around the world. News stations were covering the story, and legal experts were discussing the possible consequences he might face. Some people demanded that he receive the harshest punishment possible. This is not just a prank. This was an attack on a respected institution. One commentator said during a live news broadcast. Others pointed out how his actions reflected a bigger issue: entitled people thinking they could do anything without facing consequences. Back in his home country, his family was in crisis. His father, a well-known businessman, was furious. He had spent years building a powerful and respected empire, and now his son's reckless actions were threatening to destroy everything. Investors were starting to pull back, not wanting to be associated with a family caught in such a scandal. His company's stock prices were dropping, and reporters were constantly calling for statements. His mother, worried and embarrassed, tried to control the damage by issuing a public apology. "Our son made a terrible mistake, and we do not condone his actions in any way," she said in an official statement. But the public was not satisfied. They wanted to see real consequences, not just empty words. Inside the jail, the tourist had no idea how bad things were getting. He kept hoping that any minute now, someone would walk in and tell him he was free to go. Maybe his family would send a lawyer. Maybe the authorities would just fine him and let him go home. But as the hours passed, he started to realize the truth. This was not going to be solved with money. The palace, the police, and even the court had made it clear that his actions were serious, and they were not going to let him walk away so easily. For the first time in his life, he felt small. All his wealth, all his expensive clothes, and all his connections meant nothing in this moment. He was just a man who had made a terrible choice, and now the whole world was watching as he faced the consequences of his actions. Hours turned into a full day, and the tourist was still locked inside the cold, gray cell. His back ached from sitting on the hard bench, and his mind was spinning with thoughts of what would happen next. He had always lived a life of luxury, staying in 5-star hotels and dining at the finest restaurants. Now he was trapped in a place where the air smelled of metal and disinfectant, where the only sound was the occasional footsteps of guards walking past. He kept expecting someone to come and tell him it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe a lawyer would arrive and get him out. Maybe his father had pulled some strings. But no one came. No special treatment. No easy escape. The hours dragged on, and hunger gnawed at his stomach. When a guard finally brought him food, he stared at the plain, tasteless meal in front of him. It was nothing like the gourmet dishes he was used to. Hesitating for a moment, he picked up the food and took small bites, realizing he had no other choice. Just when he thought things couldn't get worse, an officer arrived at his cell and gave him a stern look. "Get up," he ordered. The tourist stood slowly, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. "What's happening?" he asked, trying to sound confident, but his voice came out weaker than he intended. "You're going to court," the officer replied. "It's time for you to face the charges." His heart pounded as he was led out of the cell. The reality of the situation hit him like a brick. This wasn't going away. He was actually going to stand in front of a judge. As he walked through the narrow halls, he saw other detainees being escorted as well. Some looked calm, others nervous, and a few seemed completely broken. He wondered which one he would be by the end of this. The courtroom was already packed when he arrived. Reporters, photographers, and members of the public filled the seats, all waiting to see what would happen to him. Flashing cameras went off as he was brought inside, and he lowered his head slightly, feeling the weight of the attention. As he sat down, he finally spotted his lawyer, a serious-looking man in a dark suit. The tourist let out a breath of relief, but that relief was short-lived. The lawyer leaned in and whispered, "This is serious. You're facing multiple charges, and the evidence against you is strong. The court wants to make an example out of you." The tourist's stomach dropped. "An example," he repeated. His lawyer nodded. "People are angry. They see you as someone who thinks he's above the law. The video of you pouring paint on the guard has gone viral worldwide. The authorities don't want to just let you off with a warning. There could be heavy fines, community service, or even jail time. Jail time. The word sent a shiver down his spine. He had never even imagined himself in a situation like this. He had been to court before, but always as a wealthy businessman's son, where lawyers handled everything, and he simply walked away with no consequences. But this was different. This time, he was the one on trial, and the whole world was watching. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. The proceedings began, with the prosecution showing the video of his actions. The footage played on a large screen, showing him laughing as he poured the paint, mocking the guard, and acting as if he was untouchable. The tourist could feel the stares of the people in the room: disgust, disappointment, and anger. He clenched his fists under the table. He wanted to shout that it was just a joke, that he hadn't meant any harm. But he knew that wouldn't change anything. The evidence was clear. He had disrespected a royal guard, a symbol of the country's history and pride. And now he was facing the consequences of his careless actions. The courtroom was silent as the video played, showing every moment of the tourist's reckless act. His own laughter echoed in the room, but now it felt like a cruel reminder of his mistake. He watched himself on the screen, mocking the royal guard, pouring the red paint, and smirking as if he were untouchable. It was painful to watch. He swallowed hard, glancing around the room. The judge had a stern expression, the prosecutors looked determined, and the audience, members of the public and reporters, whispered among themselves, clearly unimpressed. He shifted in his seat, feeling smaller than ever before. Then the prosecution began to speak. This act was not a harmless joke. It was a deliberate attempt to humiliate an officer on duty, someone whose job is to protect the honor and security of this nation. The defendant showed no respect for the culture, the rules, or the dignity of the royal guard. The tourist felt his face heat up. He wanted to protest, to say it wasn't that serious, but deep down, he knew that wouldn't help him now. The lawyer sitting beside him remained calm, but his serious expression made it clear this was bad. Then, a new piece of evidence was brought forward. A social media post, written by the tourist before the incident, was displayed on the screen. It showed him bragging about his trip, making fun of local traditions, and acting as if everything was just entertainment for him. The words from his own post now worked against him. The prosecution continued, "This is not just one bad decision. This is a pattern of behavior. The defendant believes he is above the law, that money and privilege allow him to do anything without consequences." The audience murmured in agreement. The tourist clenched his fists under the table. He had never felt so exposed, so judged. He had always lived a life where people admired him for his wealth, but now, that same privilege was the reason people wanted to see him punished. Then the defense lawyer stood up to speak. "My client understands that his actions were wrong. He deeply regrets what he has done and is willing to make amends in any way possible. He was not thinking clearly in the moment, and he is ready to take full responsibility." The tourist blinked. Responsibility. That was not a word he was used to. He had never had to truly face consequences before. Usually, a quick payment or a public apology was enough to move past any scandal. But this time, it felt different. The judge looked directly at him. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" For a moment, the tourist hesitated. He wanted to say something clever, something that would make people forget what he had done. But as he looked at the serious faces in the room, he knew that wouldn't work. He had to be honest. He took a deep breath. "I made a terrible mistake," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I thought it was just a joke, but I see now that it was disrespectful. I didn't understand the importance of the royal guard, and I acted without thinking. I'm truly sorry." The judge nodded but remained unreadable. "Understanding your mistake is important, but actions have consequences. This court will decide the appropriate punishment." With that, The trial moved forward. The tourist sat back down, his heart pounding. He had apologized, but would it be enough? Or was it too late to fix the damage he had done? The courtroom was tense as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. The tourist sat frozen in his seat, his mind racing. Would he be fined? Would he be sent to jail? The uncertainty made his heart pound harder than ever before. The judge cleared his throat, and the room fell completely silent. This court has carefully considered all the evidence, including the defendant's actions, his public behavior, and his statement of regret. The tourist swallowed hard. He wished he could turn back time, stop himself before he had made such a foolish decision. But it was too late for that now. The judge continued. This was not just an act of disrespect toward an individual, but toward an entire tradition and nation. Such actions cannot be ignored. A heavy silence filled the room. The tourist squeezed his hands together, waiting for the final words. You are hereby sentenced to a heavy fine, mandatory community service, and a temporary ban from entering this country for the next 5 years. A wave of mixed emotions crashed over the tourist. Relief, because he wouldn't be going to jail. Panic, because his reputation was still in ruins. Shock, because he had never faced real consequences before. Gasps and murmurs spread through the courtroom. Some people thought the punishment was too lenient, while others believed it was fair. The prosecution nodded, accepting the decision. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "This is the best possible outcome for you. It could have been much worse." But the tourist wasn't so sure. The fine would cost him a significant amount, though money was never really an issue for him. The community service, however, was something he had never done in his life. He had no idea what it would involve, but the thought of working under supervision, of being seen doing labor, made him uncomfortable. And the travel ban. That was another painful blow. He had always considered himself a global traveler, able to go wherever he wanted without restriction. Now one entire country had shut its doors to him. As the judge finished reading the sentence, the tourist stood slowly. He didn't say anything. What could he say? The decision had been made, and now he had to live with it. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed, eager to capture his reaction. Cameras flashed in his face as journalists shouted questions. Do you think your punishment was fair? Do you regret your actions? How do you feel knowing that millions of people are criticizing you? He kept his head down, avoiding their eyes. His lawyer guided him through the crowd, pushing past microphones and flashing lights. The walk to the car felt endless, with every step making him more aware of how much damage had been done. Once inside the vehicle, he exhaled heavily. His assistant, who had been silent throughout the whole process, finally spoke. "This isn't over," he said in a low voice. "Your name is everywhere. People aren't going to forget this easily." The tourist sighed and leaned back against the seat. He had never cared much about public opinion before, but now he understood how powerful it was. His social media accounts were flooded with angry comments. His business contacts had started distancing themselves. Even some of his so-called friends were no longer answering his messages. For the first time in his life, he realized that money couldn't fix everything. He had lost more than just his freedom to travel. He had lost respect, trust, and the illusion that he was untouchable. As the car drove away, he stared out of the window, wondering how he could ever rebuild what had been shattered. The tourist sat in silence as the car sped away from the courthouse. His mind was a mess, filled with regret, embarrassment, and fear about what lay ahead. He had always lived a life where mistakes could be erased with money, where problems disappeared with a phone call. But this time, things were different. This time, the world had seen his actions, and there was no hiding from the consequences. His assistant, sitting beside him, scrolled through his phone. "You're still trending," he muttered. "People are making memes about you. News outlets are still talking about the trial." The tourist clenched his jaw. He had always enjoyed attention, but not like this. He grabbed his own phone and, for the first time in days, checked his social media. Thousands of comments flooded his posts. Disrespectful. You got what you deserved. You think money makes you better than others. Not anymore. I used to follow you, but I'm done. He kept scrolling, his stomach twisting with each comment. His followers were dropping by the thousands. Brands he had worked with were publicly distancing themselves from him. Some had even canceled sponsorships. It was like watching his life unravel in real time. His assistant sighed. This is going to take a long time to fix. The tourist didn't respond. He knew the damage was deeper than just losing followers. His father had already made it clear that the family's business reputation was suffering. Investors were wary. Deals were falling apart. And all of it because of one reckless decision. A week later, he reported for his community service. Dressed in plain work clothes, he stood outside a shelter, feeling completely out of place. He had never done physical work in his life. He wasn't even sure where to start. But the supervisor, a strict-looking woman with tired eyes, handed him a broom and pointed toward the entrance. "Start sweeping," she said. He hesitated. "Me?" She raised an eyebrow. "Yes, you. Unless you'd rather explain to the court why you didn't show up." He swallowed his pride and began sweeping. It was exhausting, and within minutes, his arms ached. He wasn't used to labor, and every small task felt frustrating. But as the hours passed, he began to notice something. The people around him, the volunteers, the workers, weren't treating him like a celebrity or a rich tourist. They barely looked at him. To them, he was just another person doing a job. For the first time in his life, he wasn't being treated as special. And strangely, it felt real. Over the next few weeks, he kept returning to complete his service. He worked in kitchens, helped clean, and even spoke to people who had struggled with real hardships. Their problems made his situation seem small in comparison. They had faced things money couldn't fix: illness, loss, poverty. And yet, they still moved forward. Something inside him shifted. He began to understand what responsibility really meant. Not just saying sorry, but proving it through actions. When his community service ended, he didn't announce it on social media. He didn't post photos of himself helping people. He just finished the work quietly and left. Months later, the world slowly moved on from his scandal. News stories took over the headlines, but he was no longer the same person. The experience had changed him. He traveled less, spent more time learning, and started treating people with genuine respect. One day, he saw a picture of the same royal guard he had disrespected. The guard was back on duty, standing tall, as disciplined as ever. The tourist stared at the image for a long time, feeling a strange mix of shame and admiration. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could choose to be better. And for the first time in his life, he truly wanted to.